Okay, so let's get started with introductions. Tonight's event is co-sponsored by Western Washington University's Woodring College of Education and Whatcom Intergenerational High School. I'm going to go ahead and introduce everybody so that you'll know who's who and know who we're going to see tonight. And so as I say each of the names, ladies down in the corner, if you could wave when you hear your name, that way we know who's who, I would appreciate it. And we begin with Lisa Iverson. Lisa Iverson is director of the Center for Ancestral Blueprints and CAB Publishing based in Bellingham. She stewarded the writing project resulting in this anthology and is the author of the book Ancestral Blueprints, Revealing Invisible Truths in America's Soul. We are also going to hear from Summer Starr. Where are you, Summer? There you are with the beautiful background. Summer Starr is a workshop facilitator, healer, poet, and works in the nonprofit sector. She grew up in Blaine, Washington on a small family farm and returned to the Northwest after working on issues related to poverty in India, Ghana, and Kenya for many years, She has a master's degree in international affairs and is on the board of Still Point at Beckside, an inclusive spirituality center rooted in the Christian contemplative tradition. She's a speaker for the National Alliance of Mental Illness about her experiences with bipolar disorder. She has 2 self-published books of poetry, Wild Lotus Living and Into the Flames. And another reader this evening, contributor to the anthology, Christina Grenay. There she is. A firstborn German, moved to Bellingham in 1999. She works as a craniosacral therapist and is passionate about the human body, the healing arts, and trauma therapy. She's been fortunate to have access to her family history through living relatives, and her writing is informed by this history through the lens of her embodiment practices. And finally, our moderator this evening, Dr. Tracy Piescher. She is an associate professor of secondary education at Western Washington University. She researches and writes about the lives of children and youth who have experienced domestic violence and their challenging experiences in public schools. Her work has appeared in academic journals like the Bank Street Journal Occasional Paper Series, Cultural Studies, Critical Methodologies, Equity and Excellence in Education, and International Journal of Qualitative Studies in Education. They are all here this evening to discuss this important book right here, Whiteness is Not an Ancestor, Essays on Life and Lineage by White Women. So please join me with thunderous applause in welcoming Lisa Iverson, Summer Starr, Christina Grenay, and Dr. Tracy Piescher. Thank you.
I'm so very happy that we're all here this evening. I want to say thank you to Claire, even though we can't see her anymore. Thank you for all of your support, and thank you to Village Books for hosting this event. Thank you to Tracy, our fabulous moderator, who's been a fabulous conversation partner in this planning process. Tonight's conversation takes place from the unceded Coast Salish territory, the traditional lands of the Lummi and the Nooksack people. More recently, this land is called Bellingham, Washington, since 1903. Thank you also to Western Washington University's Woodring College of Education and Whatcom Intergenerational High School for co-sponsoring this event. It's been really exciting to us that we've had schools of learning supporting this event. I'm going to talk for just a couple minutes about how this book came to be, and Tracy and I will have some conversation before we get to hear from Summer and Christina reading from their essays. It was a year ago that I contacted a dozen women, the contributors to this anthology. The previous October, I was leading a workshop in Banff in Canada. Sonia Lee, one of the contributors also to this publication, had invited me there to lead a workshop around this topic of whiteness and ancestry. And while I was there in Banff, it was a 3-day retreat, residential retreat. During one of the evenings, I had a dream that when I woke up, the project of this writing project had been pretty clearly delivered from the ancestral realms in my nighttime sleep. So this, it was a very specific theme of this writing project, who the people were to invite, structure for the timeline, structure for the whole project. And I thought about it for about 4 months about whether or not I was willing to say yes to it. And then it was a year ago, last March, that I decided to proceed. Kind of like that train, for anybody who can hear the train whistle. I decided to proceed down the tracks of this project. And so I invited this group of women, all of whom I knew had the pleasure of knowing in a variety of ways, but all of whom had experienced the family constellation approach, which I've spent the last 20 years spending most of my time in my work life leading groups with that modality that has everything to do with working with generational histories, and particularly the processing of previously unprocessed, invisible loss and grief and traumas. So each of these women that I invited had also experienced that work, and also I knew were up to the task. That when I asked them, could you write about this? Could you write about the role that whiteness has in your life? Could you write about the role that whiteness has had in your lineages? They all said yes. So it was a 10-week process. We began writing just as COVID began. And the first draft was completed on, as it turned out, the same day that George Floyd was murdered. So the timing of it just went how it went. And I think that's all I'll say about it right now. And I want to welcome Tracy to join me so we can talk a bit further about how we got here and the themes of this project.
Thanks, Lisa. Let me start by thanking Lisa, Summer, and Christina for inviting me to moderate the discussion tonight. It's been a pleasure getting to know you all through the stories you've told and the commitments you're making to further discussions related to how privilege of whiteness lives and breathes through family lineage. Their words and stories open opportunities towards creating a more socially just community. And thank you for letting me be a part of this important conversation. And specifically, Lisa, thanks for sharing your important thoughts on the creation of the book and what inspired you to engage so deeply in this work. I'll start with these questions for you, and Summer and Christina, feel free to join the conversation as well, because it's certainly cross-dialogue at this point. And I just a reminder for audience members, please place questions in the question box. And I want to start actually with a question from the question box.
Mm-hmm.
And it probably flows with some of the other questions that we've discussed previous to the event tonight. Lisa, can you explain or speak more about the family constellation approach?
Mm.
And I've heard you explain it in other talks and its relation back to post World War II Germany.
Mm-hmm.
So that also is intriguing to me.
Yeah. Thank you. I'll say just a little bit about thank you. It's an approach that was developed by a man named Bert Hellinger, who died just a few years ago. Hellinger grew up during post-World War II Germany and the influence of that collective trauma, of course, as a German man and on European soil, certainly was a factor in his development of this approach, as was living in South Africa with Zulu tribes for 16 years. So the modality, the influence of it it's those influences and other modalities that came before it, but ultimately that approach, it's an embodied experiential, foremost developed as a group modality, but adaptable for individual work as well, that really, in a phenomenological way, helps us see the influence from one generation to the next, how much the way in which, the thing that I always say is that we're not as original as we think that we are.
Mhm.
And so, like snowflakes, we all are unique and individual. And it is one of the things that with this topic that leads us to this project, the US focuses so heavily on the individual. We're a bit out of balance. We're remembering how much the histories that have come before us are with us. And so that approach is a way that quite immediately makes that visible.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And Christina and Summer, chime in anytime you want as well. And so I'll just follow up with one of my questions. What are your thoughts on how histories carry in the body? That seems to be an ongoing theme for the whole text, and certainly the three of you and your writing in the text. And what does this metaphor mean for you in this work of thinking about whiteness and what it affords?
Mm-hmm. I have some thoughts, but I also want to welcome Christina and Summer. If either one of you want to say anything first, feel free. And if not, I'm happy to proceed.
Yeah, I think in my piece, I write about the mitochondrial DNA and the importance of the mother line, that DNA actually doesn't change for about 10,000 years. And so there's memory there. And that's carried in our bodies. There's echoes of what came before. And I think Christina and I share a love for somatic processing along with you, Lisa. And when we take time to listen to those stories, there's a deeper processing than can happen in just the mind. So that's my perspective of it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right. Well, I'll follow up with this question then. So, as you speak about this sort of embodiment or this movement through like histories, why does this matter for white people, women, white folks, to understand and efforts to engage in anti-racist awareness and practices?
Mm-hmm. I would say that one of the reasons that it matters is that our humanity doesn't come from whiteness. Our humanity comes from family and ancestry. This is our shared humanity across the globe. So we're all descendants. The things that we have in common as a species, we are all descendants. We all have ancestors. We are all future ancestors. Whether or not we have children or not, we're the stewards of the web. And that makes us future ancestors. And so our humanity as a species has had a good, 200 to 300,000 year history. Whiteness has been around about 500 years. And so this part of the world, the US and North America, the colonial history that these countries here in North America were created by, what the countries that we now, the US, Canada, for example, these are big histories. these movements of colonialism, immigration, slavery that have really this thread of disconnection from family runs through those histories in a way that, from my perspective, this time that we're living in, it's really a foundational thing that we see that helps us to put whiteness itself in perspective. Yeah.
And Christina and Summer, do you want to add anything to that? We have just a couple of minutes left for this part of the program. Okay, so I'll follow up, I guess, Lisa, specifically for you. Why a focus on whiteness and gendered female intersectionality? What was that about in the creation of the book?
The reason for inviting white women to contribute to this anthology, for it to be that focus, has everything to do with, in those histories, those colonial histories, there's a lot of, I think, often unconscious assumption that in those trauma histories, there's an assumption that men are the perpetrators and women are the victims. That's how those associations often operate in our psyche and in our histories and in our understanding of, why things went how they went or why things are how they are. And just, simply put, our humanity is much more complicated than that. And the things that have happened, the way that things have happened, particularly these collective movements, it is just much more complicated. And so there are many ways in which, and as things happened last year, the way that they unfolded with our global Black Lives Matter movement and the visibility, one of the visibilities in that, as it just happened, the Karen meme, for example, unfolded at the same time as we were doing this book. And I think all of these women shared a common capacity to talk about themselves and to write about their family histories in a way that really is strengthened by not being in that kind of a trance around trauma histories that has that kind of a gendered association with trauma histories. So that's a little bit what I would say about that. Anything else, Christina or Summer, you would add?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, as a white-bodied woman, I really recognize that I embody both the perpetrator and the victim, and I bring that to my narratives of my family history, of my current life today. And so I think there's a unique role in being able to look at both and reckon with both.
And then I just want to jump to questions. Liz asked this, and I know it wasn't mentioned yet, Lisa, but are there any proceeds from this book going to BIPOC orgs and individuals? And I know that, so if you could speak to that, that'd be great.
Yeah, you bet. The profits for December and January, all of the profits are donated to New Georgia Project, which was founded by Stacey Abrams, had everything to do with helping us have the success there with the last election. We're in a discernment about direction for proceeds, which nonprofit they'll be donated to, but essentially this is not a profit-making venture for me or for any of the contributors. This was a volunteer project for me for most of my 2020.
Great. Thanks, everyone. And thanks in particular, Lisa, for sharing your insights in the creation and the purpose of the book and the intention as you ended on. And we can now turn towards our first story tonight, shared by Summer. And I think, Summer, you're going to be the only one on screen here.
Okay.
So it's yours.
Great. This is a story of my ancestors' origins in America. It's my family's story, but it is also the story of the founding of a country based on settler colonialism, Puritanism, racism, and slavery. It is a story of how those things became tales of religious freedom and the American way. It is a story that founds the white privilege still live today, and is a story of why those who live with the most privilege are unaware of both its existence and of its origins. It is also a story of my personal journey of learning to live in greater awareness and responsiveness to the realities of the world we have all inherited in hope for a better future for human and non-human beings. Growing up in the Northwest of the United States, I had a very simple family origin story. My parents were Californians who transplanted to Washington to live closer to nature. They bought a farm in the 1970s to get out of the rat race that was Southern California. I knew that my mom's parents were both connected to orange groves. Her maternal grandfather owned an orange grove, and her paternal grandfather was the caretaker of a grove. I knew that my dad's parents had been real estate agents, but even stories of his grandparents were fuzzy, partially because his parents adopted him when they were already the age of most grandparents. So for most of my life, as far as I knew, we were just Californians. This lack of history put my focus on the now, on the immediate, and the past held very little interest for me. I was detached from the histories taught in school. My concept of family history was only a couple of generations back. That all changed the summer of 2019. 3 things simultaneously unfolded for me that summer. The first was my father finding his birth family. All of a sudden, there was an entirely new family history available to me to explore. His origins were no longer filled with family rumor and supposition, but were fully revealed. The second was that I attended an herbalism course on ancestral healing, where I was blown open to the importance of truly placing myself in the larger history of my family, especially my mother line, because of the significant influence of mitochondrial DNA on cellular memory. This led me on a mad Ancestry.com quest to track both my mother's and my father's family as far as I could go. And what emerged was a startling pattern, going all the way back in every familial line. My mother's mothers and my father's fathers all arrived in Massachusetts around the same time, about 1630, and were part of the Puritan movement there. And my mother's fathers and my father's mothers arrived in the Virginia colony between 1640 and 1700, and were part of the history of the slave trade there. I am the daughter of 2 Californians who had no idea of their family origins, and yet their ancestries are mirror images of each other and are entwined with a complicated, often tragic narrative of the founding of this country. This feels significant to me, both the synchronicity and the fact that these origins had been lost in the conscious awareness of these families, just as they have been lost in the conscious awareness for so many white Americans. It is as if by coming together so potently in my family, the facts of this country's histories are emerging to be witnessed by our combined lineages and to be reckoned with.
Thanks, Summer, for sharing your family histories. I do suggest your story is especially compelling in the book, and the difficult and fascinating, both difficult and fascinating realizations you came to while engaging in your family history, more recently too. And then, Summer, I wanted to follow up with a few questions that emerged when reading your chapter. And of course, Lisa and Christina, feel free to join the conversation. We'll give the platform first to Summer for sharing the story. And Summer, so can you share more about the meaning of these statements? You say this on page 47. And when parts of human nature are repressed, they become demonized. I inherited an unconscious demonization. So I'm intrigued. I mean, you have a lot of complexity in your chapter, but that piece especially stood out for me. I'm wondering what that means for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think this gets to a really, personal experience with mental health that I've had. I've been diagnosed with bipolar disorder and have lived with some pretty extreme polarities within my own psyche. And through that process, I really saw that there were parts of me that were kind of upheld culturally and within my family. And then there were parts of me that were, for the lack of a better word, demonized or kind of pushed away. And in doing this research about my family, I started to really think about the Puritans and kind of what their perspective of spirituality was in how they were upholding, especially the white folk, and then anything that was not masculine or white or, of a, certain mentality they would put into the dark. And it has a lot to do with how we project onto others the things that we're not ready to own within ourselves. Yeah, I think that I hold that pretty deeply as a personal experience, and then seeing it within my own family lineage as I did that historical research.
Mm. And Lisa or Christina, did you want to add anything to that? This speaks to? Okay. So Summer, you and I have talked about this, as all of us have. And I mentioned that Bell Hooks, a famous Black feminist educational scholar, and Angela Davis, well known, another powerful Black female queer activist, talks about the importance of intersectional work that needs to be built between Black and white communities, experiencing the brutal forces of class dynamics and capitalism while building coalition across their differences. You speak to this in your chapter on page 48. Can you share more about your thoughts related to this dynamic? And why might this be especially important during the times of Trumpism and challenging systemic racism? Something that you were pretty upfront about.
Yeah. So as Lisa mentioned earlier, the term whiteness was kind of invented about 500 years ago. And, the research that I've done really said that it was invented as a way to separate poor whites from poor other minorities, Black, Indigenous people. And it was a tool of the elite to manipulate the masses, really. And actually, just a few weeks ago, I watched the movie Judas and the Black Messiah about Fred Hampton and his work in Chicago with the Black Panthers, and kind of the original Rainbow Coalition that he was building there. With the Young Lords, which were Puerto Ricans, and even the Young Patriots, who were Southern poor whites, and how that was continued to be oppressed by our government, because any sort of uniting of the people who are not benefiting from the current economic system we live in is seen as a threat. And I think that that manipulation continues today. We see Trump and other alt-right people continuing to do that. So it's not a historical concept. It is very alive and active.
Mm. Just checking in. Barbara Todd is saying in the comments, my screen is frozen. Is anyone else's? So just stopping for a minute and asking Claire maybe if we're having any technical issues, or if others could write and let us know.
No, this is Claire speaking, the voice of the invisible voice of God. No, just kidding. It sounds like a connectivity issue on Barbara's end. So yeah, maybe Barbara, you could try exiting and coming back.
Great, thanks, Claire, or the FBI. That's a joke, Summer. Okay, so Summer, one last question. We have about 5 minutes left of this part of the program. Summer, you also talk powerfully of the relationship of whiteness and shame throughout the chapter. And tonight you shared the experience of discovering your family's lineage and privilege built upon institutional slavery. You state on page 49, there is a silent shame that quiets this history and tries to shove it into the past. You also end your excerpt shared tonight with the concept of reckoning. Can you and others, Christina and Lisa, if you like, speak more about this kind of reckoning and its relationship to shame and other emotions that deter white women folks from engaging in reflections on their own inherited privilege and power of whiteness?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a intersection between my piece and Christina's piece on this question, because I really see that shame as being part of the motivating factor of my family slowly migrating from the East Coast to the West Coast and kind of trying to leave behind parts of the family or family history that they did not want to face, and they just wanted to kind of run away from. And I mean, I feel it in myself too. I was a world traveler for a long time, and I loved, you know, the experiences that I had, and I grew a lot from that time. But there was also a part of me that was kind of running from really facing some of the realities here in the U.S. And I think that, you know, part of that is just the complicatedness of what we have to face, but some of it is also shame, especially as I open up more in awareness of the privilege that I've inherited because of the status of my family that oppressed other people. And, you know, my work around this issue in reckoning is kind of going back to the embodiment piece. Like, it's not just a mental thing of saying, I'm going to look at this and I'm going to understand it, but you really, you know, one of the reasons I'm so grateful for these kinds of conversations is that it takes practice to be in your body and to have these difficult conversations with people and to normalize this as a common conversation to have. And I've been privileged to be in different community groups that are starting to do this. And that's part of culture change. And that's, you know, it's not the only thing that needs to be done, because we have systems of oppression that need to be reorganized in very effortful ways and strategic ways. But if we don't do that internal work, then we're going to be projecting a lot of these internal processes of shame into that work that we need to do. So it's the both. We have to do the internal and the external work at the same time.
Yeah, I just like to add that the piece around how the untold and the told stories within our family history are shaping us. And we may be conscious or not conscious of it. And so we have a lens in which we see through and operate from. And so even if I am educated around anti-racism, I still have to, like you were saying, I still have to look at my own history and family history so that I'm really clear about my intentions and my movements.
Okay. Lisa, anything to add to that?
I mean, aside from the primary thing that's with me is how grateful and honored I feel to be with all three of you and to know all three of you. The depth of collective wisdom that's here is really with me, and it's a reminder that this is group work, that the shame that you know, you just spoke so eloquently of, Summer. I just think it's a beautiful reminder. This is group work, and so we'll talk more at the end tonight about kind of the, you know, where do we go from here kinds of messages, what we want to talk about. But I don't want to wait till the end to say that, you know, you know, the faster we can as a culture, as a Western trained mind culture, shift our perspective from it's all about I and it's all about the individual to an expansion of we, not instead of, but in addition to that we all receive wellness from that expansion. So that's what I wanted to add. Thanks.
I think I have one more thing to add in terms of, you know, the numbness that sometimes is within the white culture, that we're not even aware of. And, you know, it's like the fish who's in water doesn't realize they're in water, you know, and I think that comes from our not looking at the shame, are not doing that reckoning. And so, you know, it kind of goes back to like, how can you really do systemic change if you are in that place of numbness, your place of avoidance. Yeah.
Well, that's a super powerful way to end. I mean, the metaphor of the fish in water, right? Like white folks and whiteness and white structures is really fitting. And so I want to end this piece and make sure we have time both for Christina to share a story and address some questions, and then to make sure to give time to the audience. I know the event says 6 to 7, but I know we can go to 7:15 if there's folks who want to ask questions once Christina shares. And so thanks everyone, and thanks in particular Summer. And we can turn to the last story shared tonight by Christina. And Christina, it's yours.
Great. Thank you, Tracy.
Yeah.
So my piece is called Weltschmerz. When I sat down at the kitchen table to write my story, I entered a liminal space. I became aware of the threshold between resistance meeting grief and self-doubt meeting courage. Honestly, the process of writing became a roller coaster. Sometimes I felt frustrated with the slow flow of words, and other times overwhelmed with the flood of words spilling onto the pages. Many times a wave of grief would come over me and I would walk into the forest nearby to collect myself again. I had never before attempted to take the oral transmissions I have received from my grandmother and turn them into written words. How do I do it? Will something get lost in translation? How does my family story fit in? The title for this essay came before I wrote a single word, translated verbatim from German. Weltschmerz means world pain, and it points to the weight of the world in one's heart. My grandmother's name was Hulda, whom I lovingly called Oma. I was 7 or maybe 8 years old when I first started asking her questions about her life. Oma, what was it like when you were my age? What was your favorite food? Why can't I sometimes understand your words when you're speaking? Did you have siblings? She would stop what she was doing and shift her body towards mine to give me her undivided attention. I treasured these moments, and with every opportunity I was given, I would ask more questions. Bit by bit over the years, she filled in the puzzle pieces of the landscape of my maternal line. My great-grandparents were kulaks, peasant farmers in the Volhynia region during Stalin's government. This region bordered southeastern Poland, southwestern Belarus, and western Ukraine. Historically, Volhynia was highly sought after by the Russian Empire, as well as by the German and Ukrainian governments, and has gone through multiple annexations. It was 1933 when a man-made famine, the Holodomor, to kill by starvation translated from Ukrainian, ended in the central and eastern Soviet Ukraine. It lasted for 2 years and it killed millions of innocent people. This was also the time when the dekulakization campaign, a long drawn-out classicide against independent farmers, was drawing to an end. Any resistance coming from the kulaks resulted in killing, arrest, or displacement. My grandmother was 7 years old when the Soviets came to seize her parents' farm. Her family was allowed to take only what they could carry in their hands. This was the beginning of their escape and the last time she saw her dad and oldest brother alive. Everyone, including the children, ended up in forced labor camps. They were constantly on the move, and at night they shared the sky with other families with the same fate. There was always tension in the air, and displacement became their new way of life. In her 70s, my Oma, she would often speak of being lebensmüde, tired of life. She described it as a tension between the constant worry in her life and finally arriving at contentment. At one point, she said she was ready to go, knowing that all her children and grandchildren were safe. I related to her experience of worry. Ever since I was a little girl, I have felt a small trickle of anxiety slowly tearing away inside of me, carving away. One of the last memories Oma shared with me was during my last visit with her. It was about World War II in Poland. She was 13 years old, riding horseback through a beleaguered village. The ground was still smoldering from a recent attack by either the Germans or the Soviets, and the whole world was flammable. As she wandered, she passed by a little girl crying with no one else inside. At 85, her voice often quivered with a sense of urgency. I witnessed that Oma still regretted until that day that she did not stop and take the girl with her. Many of her stories would fill our eyes with tears. This time, we entered a long silence. Her eyes were closed, her body resting on the couch. She let out a sigh. I watched her body softening and her weary face letting go. Is this what healing looks like?
Thanks, Christina, for sharing your insightful and deeply moving story. Your Oma lingers in my memory still. And I wanted to follow up with a few questions that emerged when reading your chapter. Summer and Lisa, again, feel free to join the conversation. And one more reminder, actually, to the audience, please place questions in the question box. And I'll try my best to track questions and Claire will as well, and share with the guest speakers this evening. So Christina, the first question I had for you was, well, your story centers on the experiences of your grandmother, your Oma, being a displaced woman under harsh political experiences in Eastern Europe. Why did you focus on this story in particular? And what do her experiences help us to understand differently, or perhaps even better, about our own relationships to power and privilege as white women and white folks?
Mm-hmm. So, as a new writer, I wanted to be transparent about what was going through my mind and my emotions. So, to give some background on the process of the writing is that I remember sitting down and reflecting on the lifespan of my great-grandmother. She was born in 1892 and she died in 1966. Actually, 2 days ago was her death date. And when I took the events out of my head and put them on paper, I've created this map. I had this great amount of resistance coming up, really wanting to hold back. And so I was writing that down, that feeling that I was experiencing. And as I sat with that resistance, soon after that, this tidal wave of grief came. And so that's how this dynamic resistance meeting grief came about. Yeah.
Okay. And how does it help us? Just a second, because I kind of asked you a long question there.
Yeah. Your second question's there. The second question is that, this was my dynamic. So you may have a totally different dynamic. And my suggestion is to grapple with your very own dynamic that comes up and to allow yourself to feel your feelings, which has been really, really helpful for me. So it's just really useful to feel your feelings, to learn and grow. To learn and grow includes being in discomfort, and so any type of embodied practice has been incredibly supportive of my own growth. In fact, I saw a quote the other day when I was picking up takeout for my family. And it's a quote by James Baldwin, who was a novelist and activist and poet. And he said something so profound that really speaks actually to this question that you're asking me. He says that not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is actually faced, until it is faced. Mm-hmm. And so I can't emphasize enough how important it is to take what is in your head and marry that with your body, to thaw the ice, the numbness that a lot of us feel.
That draws us back to some of the comments Summer made as well. And Christina, you speak of entering liminal spaces in the beginning when you first begin your journey in writing your chapter. You stated this: I became aware of the threshold between resistance meeting grief and self-doubt meeting courage. And can you talk about this more? What suggestions do you have for white women and white folks listening in tonight on how to grapple with this experience? And it might just be an extension of some things you've already said, and or if Lisa and Summer want to jump in, you're welcome to.
Yeah, so the question, can you say that again?
Sure. So you talk about liminal spaces. That you experience this sort of as in academia, we talk about liminality often, but you enter these liminal spaces. And what does that mean?
Mm-hmm.
What does it mean to do this kind of work and to be honest and to face, like you mentioned, James Baldwin's challenge of we can't do these. And I know you mentioned him in light of facing pain. I mean, he really challenges white people to face this head on.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of his work, both in story and academic work. So, how do you all do this? Do you have suggestions even for audience members tonight in thinking about how to approach this kind of work?
I mean, I can kind of jump in terms of just talking again about that reckoning. If we aren't willing to be with the tension of things, then we are just kind of resting in what is, rather than, I think in order for whiteness to really be changed and processed in our society, it needs to be shaken up a little bit. And those processes of really looking at it and really grappling with the history of it, and not only the history out there, but the history within our own lineage, that's what it takes to kind of break up the stagnation that we have around this issue.
Yeah, and I think I like to add that grief, you can't reason your way through grief.
That's
you
right.
actually have to move grief through your body, through your bones. Give yourself to it.
Right. And I see some questions in the question box that I promise we're going to get to, because there's some questions that I also ask a bit later. Lisa, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to add a gratitude for Christina's Oma, because one of the things that you're reading is a reminder for all of us, is the importance of grandparents. And our culture that we live in is tends to be rather biased, again, with this lens of the individual that we have of forgetting that none of us would be here without our grandparents. There are no children without grandparents. And so our lens, we're living in a time where our lens, how we think about family constructs, family units, is often in a 2-generational system, parents and children. And that's completely unnatural. So we're invited to really look at that, look at the bigger picture of, well, how did that come to be that we think of family in a 2-generational system? That makes no sense. And so it's another reason I'm grateful for I'm excited about the Whatcom Intergenerational High School. I look forward to seeing, how that school develops here in our local community. But it's that's a remembrance of, again, our what's most natural. And so, thanks for checking to see if I had a comment. That was really with me.
Yeah, and I know I'm looking at 6:55. So just wanted to honor that time, and there's some good questions coming in too. And I promise the audience that we will definitely get to those. I think that, Christina, I might come back to you in that third question that I planned to ask you, because I think it might be an interesting way to wrap up some of the discussions tonight. I can see that there's questions that are going directly to action oriented. So I want to honor that. And if everybody is ready, we can kind of go to those questions of the audience. And I hope folks post more questions that we can grapple with. I think some of them have to do with intersectionality and what does this have to do with heteronormativity? What does this have to do with patriarchy and misogyny? And maybe we can grapple through some of those as well. The first one I want to ask about is more generalizable. Liz Johnson asked, how does embodying shame and reckoning as a white person connect to active anti-racism? Once you sat with yourself, where do you go next? That's a much better way of asking than what I had planned to ask. I think that we talked about that asking this question of what do you do now? What does this look like? And again, all of you can address this in the way you want. And so looking for, once you sat with yourself, where do you go next in terms of anti-racism?
Yeah, that's pretty huge. I mean, one of the reasons why I feel like it's so important to do the internal work and also to do the collective community work where you're actually normalizing the conversation is that only from that place can you really be effective in stepping into institutions and saying this needs to be changed, because only then are your blinders really off. And only then do you have the communication tools to call things out and to name what needs to be changed. I also think it's really important in terms of developing your internal compass for what is yours to do. There is so much to do. You know, there are so many ways that we can get involved in, the prison, the school to prison pipeline, systemic racism is endemic in our society. And so part of what we need to do is get rid of the guilt and shame so that we can have that open heart compass to say, this is my particular thing for me to do. And this is where I want to put my energy. So part of what I've been doing over the last year is creating spaces for community to normalize the conversation about whiteness. I felt like that was something that I was really called to do. And I think the next layer for me is to start to think about what are those systemic things that I want to get involved in. I work for a local nonprofit, and there's a lot around systemic racism in the work that we do. And we're just as an organization really talking about how to apply equity lenses to our work. There's a steep learning curve, and we all got to do it.
And Lisa and Christina?
Christina, anything you want to?
What I would say is just to keep staying awake and staying engaged with your community. And as Summer was saying, know what your capacities are and kind of take even small little steps. It doesn't matter, but it takes everyone to take part in it, to take the systems down, because they're huge. They're everywhere across this country, and
my echoing of what you're both saying would be to say that there are these, as I think about it, there are capacities. There are capacities that are useful ones as individuals and in families and as a culture to consider expanding and developing new muscles. And so one of these has to do with thinking more systemically about everything. And so we've come to, the phrase systemic racism is becoming more and more available. Last week, I was thinking about, why don't we think about systemic whiteness? How much farther we might, that's a lens to think about systemic whiteness in all systems that we create. How that happens, because the systems we create, whether they're whether they're universities or schools or faith communities, they get created by groups. And so learning about those processes are also really important. Groups are very complicated, but the first group that we're a part of, the first group that we belong to, is our families. And that's why the family piece for me is so critical. We might not always feel like we belong, but we do, because that's where our humanity comes from. And so the knowing that we belong versus feeling like we belong are two different things. And so so there's a lot to do. There's a lot to do. I appreciate the question very much.
Great. And so I want to ask some questions, because there's some real questions coming up about intersectionality, which I sort of thought would come up tonight. And Tracy Murphy from Victoria, hi Tracy, I know Tracy, she asked this question: can you please talk about your thoughts on the role of patriarchy? And then I'll add misogyny. I'm not sure that I understood the opening comment about the trauma of women, and this was a further back. But, and I know, Tracy, I don't know if you came in later or not, but Lisa sort of talked about why the book was created as a conversation, especially with white women, and thinking about this work. But thoughts on that? And then I'll just add that Tim, I gotta get down there, Tim. Tim asked, do you have any of the authors have thoughts about the specific entanglement of whiteness and heterosexuality, heteronormativity? And the thoughts on that and how we make sense of that.
And the train is bringing an answer as well.
That is not me, though the train can be in my background. It's true. I have headphones in. So.
I could say a little bit first, unless Summer or Christina, do you want to say anything first?
Go ahead.
Okay. A few things I would say. Patriarchy, how I think about it is that it's a structure that has had a very long run, and that the time we're living in is one in which there's a shift from that structure. This is a time of change, and I think, depending on who you ask, I'm going to bow down to my favorite astrologer, Sheila Boulanger, who is a brilliant person in our midst. I think that perspectives from a larger perspective, cosmological perspective on these structures are really helpful, because our human inclination is to have a lot of ego attachment to thinking, oh, it must be this way or it's that way. And for me, I like to kind of look at a variety of ways of looking at things to learn, for learning purposes. So I think it's a structure that's been around for a very long time, and it's shifting. And as that's happening, the first book that I wrote, one of the chapters I named Hospice for Patriarchy, because my feeling was, okay, it's coming down, and it's as with any ending, as with any death, there's a lot of different ways to die, and there's a lot of different ways to end. And there's a lot of visibility, particularly these last 4 years, of the expression of the parts of people who don't want that structure to end. And so I think that that's part of what the time that we're living in is, that I think there's a death rattle for patriarchy, and that these expressions, for example, that we saw on January 6th, that we saw in the 2016 election, it's there's a lot of different ways that, who is authorized to be in charge and the authority, etc. That's been white men for hundreds and hundreds of years, and that's shifting. And misogyny has been a cousin. One way to think about that. I mean, it's been a tool. I mean, I always think, misogyny and racism, they go together. It's all these elements, they intersect with one another. And yeah, that's what I would say right now. I could go on and on, but given time, I'm going to stop for now and see if anybody else wants to.
I feel like it's important to recognize what happened in Atlanta and the intersectionality of misogyny, and
Yes.
you know, honor the tragedy of that event during this time. I also wanted to mention there's a really great podcast called Book on Fire podcast. They looked at the book Caliban and the Witch by Silvia Federici, which talks about the origins of capitalism in Europe and kind of what happened with religion, what happened with gender roles, and they expand it beyond the binary gender roles into the larger sense of gender, and as well as with racism, and it gives a historical underpinning to the power structures that were being put into place and how that was manipulating people way back when, you know, when my people colonized this country. They brought that trauma with them. And so it's, you know, it's a long history. It's pretty deep in our blood. And I really appreciate the work of Resmaa Menakem, who talks about, you know, trauma that isn't healed becomes culture. And I think that that's what we're seeing in our cultures, that there's this huge legacy of trauma that was instigated with power structures in Europe that has continued here. And like Lisa said, we're hearing the death rattle. So, yeah.
And Christina, would you like to add anything to that?
No, thank you.
Okay. Well, I'll add as just as a commentator, I mean, as a moderator tonight, thinking about the intersectionality that Tim and Tracy asked about, and I think Summer, your response, especially Lisa, thinking about, you know, that in the critique of especially Black feminists and other feminists of color, to push white women, to think about white feminisms and beyond. And I think it's something similar that you find from queer communities, queer identified people, to think about. If you think about the intersectionality of being Black, transgendered, female identified, and thinking about the compounding the compounded factors involved in the identities and what that looks and feels like. I think Summer, you're speaking to that. So that's the bigger work. And you know, I want to bring us back. It's 7:07, and folks, make sure to throw questions in there, because I think we have roughly about 8 minutes. I think Village Books would like us to close by 7:15. You know, I want to bring us back because I really appreciate sitting in and I'll say to Tracy and Tim too, feel free to ask follow-up questions if it wasn't addressed. You know, for Summer and Christina, and I think Lisa too, just sitting through as editor and editing and inviting these stories in, I think some of the viewers tonight might wonder, when you bring these ghosts that haunt out of the cellar or wherever, whatever metaphor we want to pick, there's a hauntedness to it, right? So for Summer and Christina, your stories of family lineage are fascinating and difficult. How have you come to terms with it with other family members? Because I think that would be something important to talk about as folks leave this talk tonight. Regardless, if hopefully you end up reading the book and it's super useful to you, certainly you're going to walk away hearing that stories are front and center here, not necessarily theory. And I love theory. And yet the stories foretell something. So how have you come to terms with it with other family members? And how do you suggest others engage in this kind of exploration and sometimes brutal honesty? Because I think, as Summer and others have mentioned tonight, this is the work of anti-racist work. and as well, Christina, and the shame and facing it head on. So what do you do when you start to name these things in your own family? And how do you engage in this process?
Yeah. For me, this is really sensitive work. I have a lot of love for my family. There's kind of that underlying sense of heart that I feel fortunate to have. But that doesn't mean that we all see things the same way. And I feel like in some ways I've become kind of the pot stirrer in the family. And I know that this piece has ruffled some feathers. And in my mind, that's a good thing. Like I said, going back to that reckoning, if we're doing anything to sort of break up some of that stagnation, even if it's not, we don't see an exact movement forward. I feel like any sort of awareness building is a positive thing. I personally don't feel like I need to go into every family event and with an agenda. I don't feel like that's helpful for our relationships or for, even furthering the conversation around racism. But I am going to speak my truth. And sometimes that truth is not asked for. Sometimes that's kind of the subtle thing is, well, let's just not talk about anything related to something that might be controversial. And maybe that's my growth area is like, how do I speak my truth even when it's not asked for? But yeah, I don't know if my brother is watching, but I'm going to give a shout out to him. But, I talked to him I sent him an email about, the importance of him doing this work. He has 2 kids and is really busy. And he's like, I don't know if I have time. And I'm like, your kids are going to have to do this if you don't, and so if we want to pass something down, doing this work is really primary. So I guess that's all I have to say.
Thanks, Summer.
Yeah, I like to add that my family, the ones living over in Europe, is very, very small, and they have always done a great job leaving things under the carpet, not wanting to talk about. And I was the only one who was willing to listen to my grandmother speak about the domestic violence, the sexual assaults, on and on. I can go on around that. And it was just, shh, be quiet, don't talk about it. And so for me, learning about the intergenerational trauma, I have the chance to participate in intergenerational healing. And so my hopes is to translate this and hoping that nothing gets lost in translation, translating it back into my native tongue, German, and hand that book to my nieces and nephews. I really believe within this process that whiteness benefits from being cut off from history. And this is a way, turning towards your family history is perhaps a way to subvert whiteness. And
subvert and topple, or at least challenge differently. I think that's why I accepted the invitation when Lisa reached out to me, because it's an interesting intervention that I don't think that I see very much in academia. And there's a number of people trying to do this kind of what we call critical whiteness work in academia. So yeah, that's both challenging it and naming it, facing it, if you will. And then Lisa, did you have any thoughts on that last piece? We just have about a couple minutes.
Yeah, thank you. I would add that I think we're at the beginning as a country. I'm just going to focus on the U.S., a little group of of Americans that I think we're at the beginning of we're being invited to see the way that whiteness, the idea of whiteness, also affects how it is that we think about family. And there's a violence to whiteness that's insidious, that affects how white families think about what their family is supposed to be. And so I'm interested in that. I'm interested in unpacking, you know, the way in which the idea of whiteness, it's like, you know, speaking of the water, it's like in the water of our constructs of everything and the perfectionism. You know, my last 20 years, the work that I've been honored to do, to be with families, where there's always one of the things that brings people to the groups that I'm in has to do with there's always something that hasn't been talked about. There's a family pattern, there's a difficulty, there's a pain, etc. Well, in my mind, that means that a lot's happened. A lot's happened. And so we're invited into that space, I think, just every day with one another. I hope, that's my prayer, that we're invited, you know, as we go forward, to really have a kindness toward ourselves and one another about those histories, because it's all in process.
Right. And I think that we're right at the end of this. And I know I'm a very action-oriented person, and I do a lot of activism, and I've been doing for my 29th year in public education now. And yet there is something about this kind of slowness that's in the face of the urgency that we have the privilege to even sit here and have the conversation tonight. It's for white women, identified women. So we're acknowledged that first. I think that's fair, that we have the privilege to do this. But importantly, that I think we're in need of interventions again. And I see this, at least my experience, reading this book and reading your stories and listening tonight, I'm reminded that it's a necessary intervention to slow down and to feel and to be with it, and to understand that we participate through our ancestors in sustaining whiteness. And, you know, I'll end here. We had a question we didn't get to. It was a question about reconciliation, and to what extent do each of you believe that actually reconciliation can actually occur? And it still leaves itself, it sort of haunts this. Like, what does reconciliation look and feel like? And I don't mean reconciliation necessarily for white people or white women, but for communities of color, right? And so it sits there, and we have a time limit, and also the intention of the book as well. So I don't know if there's any closing statements. I know now we're at 7:17, and Claire's jumped on now. That's our sign. Let's all thank Lisa and Summer and Christina tonight for sharing and sitting through this discussion. And thank you, Village Books, for co-sponsoring as well, and Woodring, where I teach, and Whatcom Intergenerational High School.
Yeah, I want to thank all of you. I want to thank Summer and Christina for sharing your stories, your very personal stories. I appreciate that. And this whole just being in the audience, you know, for this last bit, I mean, it's just all fascinating stuff. And, you know, I come from a family of Southerners. My parents left the South, and my people are, you know, all my ancestors are Alabama and Mississippi, and there's lots of deep stuff in there. And my little foursome, my parents and my sister and me were the ones who left. So we're like the outliers of the family. And so I could relate and it gave me so much to think about. So thank you very much. And Tracy, oh my goodness, an amazing moderator. You didn't need my help with the Q&A. You're a pro.
Thanks,
So
Claire.
so final thoughts, ladies. Do you have anything you want to say?
Just echo the thank you to be able to have these conversations. And thank you for everybody who showed up to participate.
Yeah, what a crowd.
Yep.
Is that 160 people, Claire?
160 people registered, and people have kind of been going in and out. I won't actually know until it's over how many people total attended live, but we had 160 people register for this event, and that is a good number. So
Especially
thank you to everybody.
Zoomville.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And again, that green button wasn't there center screen when I did my intro, but I got it up there quick where it says purchase Whiteness is not an ancestor here. If you click on that, it'll take you straight to the Village Books website where you can purchase a copy of this book. So, and thank you to those of you who already did. We appreciate that. And unless anybody else has something to say, I think this is where we say goodnight.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thank you. Good night.